Welcome to our very first colloquium for the spring 2017 season. We are delighted to have all of you here in our audience. And also to our online students, welcome to you too. Now, in-person audience, will you say hello to the online audience? Hello, thank you very much. All right, so a couple things. So to my online students, I want you to know that if you're watching the live stream, you should be using Firefox, because if you use Chrome, it's not supported and you'll get a blank screen. So Firefox is the one to use. Also, if you have questions that you want to ask our guest speaker, please tweet them to @cpascal, hashtag LIS502. I'd also like to start our colloquium by welcoming Dr. Daphne Lemish to come and say a few words. Dr. Lemish is our Associate Dean of Programs here at SCI in her role as ADP, which is the first ADP that we've ever had, our Associate Dean of Programs at SCI. She's responsible for, I have to put my glasses on, connecting the dots between our various initiatives and departments. She is charged with developing new programs, refining existing programs, and considering issues of recruitment, retention, and quality. Daphne received her PhD in communication from Ohio State and has a distinguished career in academia, both in the U.S. and in Israel. Her research interests revolve around children in media and representations of gender. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Daphne Lemish, who is going to say a few words and introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Matt Weber.
Thank you. Thank you, Connie. The really important person is not me, but Dr. Matthew Weber, who is going to be our speaker tonight, and I'm delighted to introduce him. Dr. Weber received his PhD in 2010 from Annenberg School of Journalism and Communication at USC, the University of Southern California. He's here an assistant professor in the Department of Communication here at SCI, and he's also the director of the network. It's called SCI, Network Science Research Lab, right? That's the correct name. I'd like to read you about his research a little bit, just a tiny bit introduction. I just want to make sure I don't, I do justice to his description of his research, so I prefer to read it. So, Matthew's research examines the evolution of the news media industry in response to the introduction of new information communication technology. His recent work includes a large-scale longitudinal study examining strategies employed by media organizations for disseminating news and information through online hyperlink networks. Subsequent research includes an examination of the effectiveness of adopting social media within organizations in order to share knowledge and to collaborate with teammates. His work is funded by the National Science Foundation, William T. Grant Foundation, Institute of Museum and Library Services, and others. Matthew's work has been widely published in leading journals as well as in the popular press. Today, Matthew will focus specifically on his work with the Internet Archive that emerged from studying organizational change over time in order to study digital traces of new networks. I am excited and looking forward to learn a lot from him, and please welcome Dr. Matthew Weber.
Thank you for having me here today, and hi to everyone who's online. I'm just moving one thing over. So I want to show you that while I'm talking. All right. Good to go. All right, so it's a pleasure to be here today. Everyone can hear me? Okay. So today I want to talk about web archives and practice and research. And first, I want to take a second and thank Daphne and thank Connie for welcoming me, for organizing this, and thank the MI program for having me here today. This is a really nice break for me because, as Daphne was saying, I spend most of my time studying organizational change. I'm doing a lot of work looking at news ecosystems, evolution of news media, and I'm here talking about Internet Archives, which is kind of awesome because it has nothing to do with the core research questions that I write in, day out, but yet it's become this important tool that I utilize in my research. And it's an area where I find so much passion, people who are so driven to explore this topic. It's just really something I enjoy getting to refocus on. So this has been a nice opportunity to think about that aspect of my work. I'm going to say a little today about the Internet Archive and talk about what it is and why I use it for research, how I use it for research, why it's important. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I think archiving data is important. I'll then shift gears. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we are doing here at Rutgers, some of the projects that I'm leading to create new archives and why that's important, what the research utility of that is. And then finally, I will wrap up by giving you a really light overview of some of the research that we are doing using Internet Archives. If there are questions as I go through, if there are points that you want to clarify, feel free to raise your hand, give me a shout out. We can be a little bit informal with that because I would like to clarify as we go through. But for more substantive questions, please just wait for the end, and I'll be happy to answer those as well. I think we've got some time for Q&A. I'm going to start by saying a little bit about the need for preservation. And I'll start first by saying a little bit about how I came to this topic. As Daphne was saying, I study evolution of organizations, specifically focusing on the way that news media organizations have changed in the online space. I started working on this research in 2008 when I started my PhD, and at the time knew that I wanted to study news media organizations. I knew this was where my passion was. I'd come out of working as a professional journalist. I worked as a journalist for a couple of years, and then I worked on the business side of journalism. I knew that this was what I wanted to study. Problem is that in 2008, sitting there in PhD classes saying, look, I want to study the way that news media has changed online, and I'm looking for data that I can use to study this, and there's just nothing available. Where could you find stored web pages that showed you what New York Times looked like in 2002? I couldn't find it. And it happened that about a year later, I was at a conference over in Oxford, and I sat down next to this woman I was seated next to at one of the sessions, and it turns out she was the director of research for a group that I had never heard of called the Internet Archive. And turns out, lo and behold, I'm telling her about my problem, and she's, we have all that data. We make some of it available, but no one's using really the majority of what we've got. I said, well, okay, let me give that a try. And that's really how I ended up down this road, and it's been a long road, and it's changed quite a bit over the past decade or so. But it's really a critical area when we think about the content that we're producing as a society and what we need to be saving. And the reality is, despite the fact that we're doing a better job educating and talking about the need for online preservation, we still do a really crappy job of saving what we put online. First and foremost, I can tell you, the numbers change. It's really hard to get good metrics on this, but the last metric I heard from the folks at the Internet Archive is that by their measures, the average web page lives for 120 days, and then it's gone. Based on data from the GDELT project, which is a project that is now housed out of George Washington University, but funded by a number of different groups, including the National Science Foundation, around 1.5% to 2% of news articles that they monitor on a typical day are gone 2 weeks later. And about 5% after a month are gone, 7 to 14% after 2 months. And that's news content. That's content we really should have a mission for saving. Elsewhere, we can turn to groups like the Reynolds Journalism Institute that's done some work on this. And they did a survey in 2014 of 70 digital-only, 406 hybrid digital and print newspapers. And they found that of the hybrid newspapers, only 12% reported that they were actually backing up their digital news content. That'd be newspapers that have a print and online component. And then for the ones that were digital only 20% reported that they were 20% reported that they were backing up none of their content. So that's pretty sad. We're not saving a lot of the content that we're putting online. And yeah, when you get into news media where you think we should be preserving that content, we find that the numbers are even scarcer. And there's some important reasons why we should be saving this content. Some interesting stories that come out of web preservation. I think we can all probably talk about the reasons why this is important for creating a societal record, a record of the way that people have interacted, the events that we've lived through. It's also an important tool for understanding history and discovering the events that have occurred over time. So I'll give you an example. This is from May 2003. This is directly out of the Internet Archive. This is an archived web page that I pulled out. So this page was archived on May 8th, 2003. It's from May 1st, 2003. And this was content capturing the press releases from Bush's White House pertaining to combat operations in Iraq. So read the headline here. President Bush announces combat operations in Iraq have ended. So now we're going to flip, and I'm going to show you the same web page that was captured in October of 2003. So here's the same web page captured in October 2003. Now take a look. I'm going to flip back again. May, October. So look at the headline. Slight little word change. This actually became a major news story because the Bush White House in May of 2003 was saying that all combat operations had ended, and lo and behold, we started to see a reemergence of the insurgency in Iraq. And the White House, rather than addressing the issue, simply sought to address it by going back and changing the press releases that they had on their website. So if you'd gone to the whitehouse.gov website to look for this press release, you would have seen in October that major combat operations had ended on a press release that still dated May 1st, 2003. And yet the Internet Archive tells you the true story. And we're seeing a lot of that now with the Trump administration and the changeover from the Obama administration, where certain sections of different governmental departments are being entirely scrubbed from websites. The latest one that I saw was that I think it was Health and Human Services had removed an entire database that was tracking information pertaining to animal welfare and animal abuse. And that entire database has now been taken down from that website. That content's available in the Internet Archive. It's been saved, it's been stored, and that's the only place it's been available. I'll give you another really quick example, large-scale example. This is CNN's coverage of Hurricane Katrina. CNN made available shortly after Hurricane Katrina a archival repository that contained their coverage of the event, except that what they had done is they had taken the coverage, they had really curated it and scrubbed it to tell a very clean and clear narrative of the way that Hurricane Katrina unfolded if you were in New Orleans at the time. The problem was that the way that that story was retold, you lost a lot of the chaos and a lot of the raw emotion that was actually what we felt and experienced if you were watching that on the news or if you were there and present and living through the unfolding of this event. It's not the same story that you capture if you actually go back and look at the CNN coverage as it unfolded on the Internet Archive. And here you can see the dates here. This is August 27th, 4:41 a.m., 28th, 4:18 p.m., and these are the actual pulls that the Internet Archive has scraped down. So you're able to get a much more accurate retelling of what the event was. We see the hurricane coming in, and then we start to see the aftermath unfolding, and you get a much rawer sense of what actually occurred, what the history was. We'll switch gears. I'll show you a much more local example. I gave a talk last week to superintendents of New Jersey talking about the need for preservation on a very local level. And one of the superintendents was from the Ocean City School District, and so I just pulled a quick snapshot of the Ocean City School District's website, and I went into the Internet Archive to see what content they have available, and I'll show you the Internet Archive in a minute. But here's just a snapshot of what their interface looks like. You can actually go in, you can put any URL in, and you can see how much has been crawled and grabbed, and they're really crawling and grabbing on a donated basis. There's no real strategy to this, so it's going to, you hope your website got captured. It doesn't always. And in this case, for Ocean City Schools, it happens their webpage was captured, which is awesome. We can go back and we can see what it looked like. And in their case, this is actually the only archive that they have. They didn't even know they had this until I showed the example. And it's really good for them because it contains some records of programs that no longer exist that they potentially want to be recreating. So there's some information here that's really important on the web that exists nowhere else. But it's not a perfect record. Oh. But it does contain some content, some news stories, some of the information that they wanted. And I kind of click through here to show them what's in here and what's not in here. And you can see one of the links, I believe this was the Winter 2015 Community Letter Resources. That didn't get captured, and that's gone. The Dealing with Crisis link, that was still active. You could grab that information. It's kind of hit or miss. The Internet Archive is broad in scope. It's not necessarily deep in terms of depth, particularly in terms of what they make available publicly. There was a question up back?
Maybe a little about
did.
Everything. Only now you weigh a machine, back machine, capture previous website, with
Yeah.
climate change,
Yeah.
everything.
So there's a joint agreement between the Internet Archive and Library of Congress, and the Internet Archive performs at the end of every congressional session what they call an end-of-term crawl. So every time a new administration comes in, they partner together to crawl the entire .gov domain. So that content has been captured. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit organization. They're funded off of donations largely, including technical donations of servers and equipment. They're founded and run by a man named Brewster Kahle, who is best described as a hippie, I think a self-described hippie, not very trustful of government, and so he actually made the news when Trump was elected. He got on to Rachel Maddow and was saying, we don't quite trust this administration, so we are making copies of all of our data, and we're moving to Canada. And he actually is in the process of moving a copy of the Internet Archive up to Canada because of concerns for the security of the data. There's a copy of the data at the new Library of Alexandria in Greece. There's a copy retained there, and they've been very prolific about getting copies of the content out.
And if you go back into the archives of our colloquium, Brewster Kahle was here.
Yes,
Running
last
the
year.
colloquium
Yeah.
last September.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
You mentioned the New York Times. Actually, New York Times, you can find archives back in the 90s or 80s.
you can, and they're a rarity. Most newspapers are not that good. They're truly a rarity in terms of actually archiving as extensively as they have. I just want to pull this up quickly. So I'll say a couple words right now just about the Internet Archive, and then I'm going to talk about resources more broadly. The Internet Archive, as I was saying, is a nonprofit organization. I got one. I'm good. Thank you. They have 8.5 petabytes of digital archived web data that they make available, but they're not just archived web data, so this will be my promotional 60 seconds for the Internet Archive. I promise I'll do this for them every time I talk because they are amazing research partners. If you have not gone to the Internet Archive, I highly recommend you check out this website. It's archive.org. And what the vision of the Internet Archive is not just to become an archive of the Internet, but to become a free and open library of content relevant to our living society. So as you can see here, they have 11 million books that are archived. You can see the book icon right there. They have 3.1 million movies, 3.3 million digital audio files, 1.3 million TV episodes, 155,000 software programs that they've archived, 1.4 million photos, 173 audio recordings, and on. You noticed at the beginning I had the Oregon Trail on my front page. And if you go and click on software and click on MS-DOS games, they have emulators for all of these programs. So boom, there you go. Not too bad. You can go play Oregon Trail. So if you want to get, for me, back to early elementary school, you can go relive those days. Pac-Man's on here. There's a little bit of something for everyone. There are Sega games on here, Atari games. Other one I want to highlight for you is the largest collection of live Grateful Dead recordings anywhere in the world. Again, I said Brewster's a little bit of a hippie. Here you go. And you can see, if you want to hear the Grateful Dead playing at Cornell University, Barton Hall, 1977 on May 8th, the live audio track is available for you free. There's no charge for any of this. And there are quite a few books that have run out of copyright now that they retain and they keep digital copies of. That would be largely what's under the text section. And you can see the different library collections that they have available here. So a pretty awesome resource just in terms of what's available and how much content is there.
So archiving newscasts and speeches?
One of their new projects, yes, is actually archiving live newscasts. They started beta testing this in Philadelphia, recording the newscasts of Philadelphia TV stations and making full text available. They are actually seeking research partners to engage with studying that content. They have it. They don't know what to do with it. So there is a treasure trove of news content that they're starting to archive. It's really important for us in the U.S. because we're one of the few major countries that doesn't have a established national priority for archiving online content. British Library has a mission to record British.gov content, British web content. France and the BNF archiving national content. We don't have a national library with a mission for archiving web content. The Library of Congress partners with the Internet Archive, and the Internet Archive performs the crawls, but the Library of Congress is not actively doing large-scale web crawling. So it's an interesting dilemma in the United States. So as I was just saying, we have the British Library, but in the US, we have the Internet Archive, and we're really dependent on this as a location for saving web content. If you're interested, you can help the Internet Archive. If you have content that you think that they should be saving, you can go to archive.org/web, and if you see on the bottom right, Save Page Now, you can actually give them recommendations on links to record, and they will save that content for you. Moving into the research side a little bit and talking a little bit about what they do as a service. The Internet Archive, about 7-8 years ago, started a program called Archive It. Archive It is a subscription-based archiving service that's available to the general public, but really intended as more of an institutional service where institutions can buy a subscription where they partner with the Internet Archive. The Internet Archive provides the space and the expertise, and they then archive the content for you. So an example of that would be the state of Alaska decided a couple of years ago that they wanted to begin archiving their end of governor term web content. And so they pay a $5,000 per year subscription to the Internet Archive, and the Internet Archive then archives the end of governor term crawls. So for instance, if you wanted to see all of the web content that was available during Sarah Palin's term in office, that's now available because Alaska has made this decision to partner with Archive It to save that web content. They are also available as partners to universities such as ourselves, and we've partnered with them here for a number of different projects to create some custom archives, and I'll show you one of those in a little bit. For those who are more technically inclined, there are products like Heritrix, which is also an Internet Archive product. There are others as well that allow you to create your own open source archives. So if you don't want to use the subscription-based service, Heritrix is available as an open source solution. Yeah?
When you use Heritrix, obviously you get the local files.
Yeah.
Does it connect in any way to the Internet Archive, or could you post
You could. You can link the two. One of the issues for the Internet Archive over the years has been that connection between local repositories that you would build through an open source database like this and their broader collection. And just in the past 2 years, they've started to get much better about developing API interfaces that allow for better push and pull of data back and forth. They're actually just working on right now a new API that is going to allow institutions like Rutgers to better pull down data that we want to get back from the Internet Archive. Right now, they're really good about taking data, and they're struggling with how to give the data back. We're actually a research partner in that project. We'll be beta testing that API next year. Okay, so now I'm going to say a little bit about how we actually go about creating digital archives, what the curation process looks like, and how it's useful for myself as a researcher, why this is an important research tool. And I'm going to do this by talking about a project that's funded by the Democracy Fund. This is work that I'm doing jointly with Phil Napoli at Duke University, formerly was at Rutgers University. This is a project to create an archive of local community news across the United States. The research intent behind this project is that we want to create a better snapshot of the content on local news websites in order to understand how much local community news influences individual participation in politics. The hypothesis here, the working hypothesis, is that the more you have access to local web content, local news content about your community, the more likely you are to engage in civic society. We want to see what factors determine the amount of local community news that you have available, and then in turn, how that relates out to your engagement in the civic process. And so what we've done is we created a random sample of 100 communities around the United States. We started with U.S. Census data. We looked for mid-sized communities between 75,000 and 125,000 individuals, and we selected a random sample of 100 and then partnered with the Internet Archive through the archive its service to create our own archive. And last summer, over the summer, we created what we call a constructed week sample. So this isn't a true Internet Archive in that we're not crawling every week and trying to get a really large archive. This has a very specific research purpose. But this created a substantive collection of archived local community news content that gave us a first real snapshot that we've been able to find of local community news across the United States. I'll show you a little bit about what we can see in the collection. But one of the cool things with this is that we started this project. We had limited funding to build the archive from the Democracy Fund. And once the Internet Archive saw what we were doing, they said, "This is awesome. Do you mind if we keep crawling this?" Sure. And so now this crawl has lived on, and this is actually being built out into a much larger archive of local community news coming from that initial research question. So there's some really cool high-level things you can do here. You can get a snapshot of the different file types. You see on the right the top 10 file types by document content type, giving you a snapshot of what you actually have in your archive. So this is a global level view, and we can see, not shockingly, the majority of the content in here would be HTML. The second highest, most frequent content in here would be images. And then after that, you have videos, and you have some audio files that trace after that. We can also see where the content's coming from, what the hosts are, what the root URLs are. And then more relevant to the work that my team's been doing, we can actually go back in and view the actual content and browse through the actual web pages. So here, we're actually drilling down to the content level, and you can see we have, for instance, 1013.iheart.com, and we have it captured, if you look right here, 19 times between July 27th, 2016 and January 2nd, 2017. We have 1013thebrew.iheart.com, and so on and so on. We have 663 of these local community platforms that we've captured. Once you click, in this case, this is the Antioch Herald, you're able to see the content we have archived here, and then you drill down further. And because we created this archive and we specified what we wanted to crawl, we specified we wanted the entire website, the advantage of building it on your own, you get to control the depth. We have the Antioch Herald here, and we actually have all of the content that is in the Antioch Herald for that date. So if you want to go through and learn a little bit more about what the Antioch Herald had to say about the People's Choice Award winners from September of 2016, we have that content available. So it's interesting as a service, but on the research side, it allows us to go through these websites, and we've had a group of graduate students working with us, and code the degree to which these websites actually have content that is covering local community events and local community information, like Assemblymember Frazier adding voice to condemnation of hate crime in Antioch. And that would be an example of the types of stories that we're trying to find and trying to pull out. As we go through, we're finding many communities where we have deserts. For instance, Newark, New Jersey happens to be one where we have found a local community news desert. There simply isn't much local community news. And yet other communities like Antioch, for example, have very rich local community news coverage. And so we're just in the process of getting the results out from that study. I can't say too much about that at this point because we're in the midst of really coding the websites, but it is giving us a really good snapshot as to what is going on at the local community level. So I do want to say a little bit about the broader research agenda here, and I want to show you a little bit about what we can actually find with this data. Why does this all matter? Why, as a researcher, am I spending a decade now, almost, working with this type of data? As I was saying at the beginning, the bottom line here is we have all this data, 8.5 petabytes of data that the Internet Archive has been storing, and for a long time, we simply haven't been able to use this type of data. We haven't been able to access it. We haven't been able to analyze it. The problem for a long time was that, simply put, there just weren't tools. There weren't the databases. There weren't the tools that were available for researchers to be able to interface with this type of digital library. So at Rutgers, we've been running a project called Archive Hub, which has funding from the Internet Archive, and we have partners at Northeastern University who are working with us on this to create create and disseminate guidelines and tools for conducting what we're referring to as theoretically and methodologically rigorous longitudinal research using archival web data. Basically, we want to crack open the Internet Archive and start working with this data. In part, we've been enabled in this process by the fact that the Internet Archive has become much more rigorous and scientific about the way they disseminate their data. They've started to rely on ISO standards for outputting the data, such as the WARC data format, which is the Web Archive data format, which is a metadata format that sits on top of these web pages. So where I was talking about the Internet Archive being 8.5 petabytes, we don't have to worry about that anymore. We can take that 8.5 petabytes, and if we just take the metadata, which is what all this junk is, we can take that 8.5 petabytes, and suddenly that becomes 1.5 petabytes. It's better. And then when we start to pull out subsets from that data, when we start to say, okay, I just want to look at all of the websites pertaining to Hurricane Katrina, and I just need the metadata because all I really need is the HTML content. All I really need is the text that's in there. Now we're getting down to 50 gigabytes, 100 gigabytes. And now first of all, we're down to a size that I can understand. Because if I talk to my mom and I say, Mom, I'm working with a petabyte of data, she's like, you're doing what now, huh? If I say, I've got like 5 CDs worth of data, that she can understand. And that we can actually talk to people about, and that we can work with. And we're suddenly getting to a threshold where we can move from, I need a high-performance computing cluster, and I need to know Hadoop, and I need to know Pig, to I can put this into Excel. And we're getting there. And that's been one of the big changes in this space. We do use a high-performance computing cluster, and we do use Pig, and we do use Hadoop, but what we do is we take all of the data that we have from the Internet Archive, and we've got quite a bit of it here, and we crunch it down, and we process it out into text data and linked lists that are nice little text-based data formats that you can crack open in Excel, or something close to Excel. So we're getting closer to that longer-term vision of being able to do this. In this example, I have this notation on the left of the 20th Century Collection, which I always find kind of cute. That's how the Internet refers to all of their web content that they have for 2000 and prior. It was now the 20th Century Collection. It's a little antiquated, but nevertheless. So we can start to do some neat things with this. In fact, I'll show you a snapshot here. This is a visualization that was generated by processing the 20th Century Collection and looking at any mentions of location of the website. So it was extracted out using a couple of text scrapers and using a couple fields that we knew could recognize for dates. And this was done in partnership with Vinay Goel at the Internet Archive. And we can start to show you, if you look at the top from the date line from 1996 going forward, where websites were appearing in the United States. Let's see if I can get that to play. Yeah, we're going. 97, the web starts to come alive. Going forward. And you start to see some hubs where websites are identifying where they originated from. Northeast Corridor, California, Chicago, Seattle. And even today, if you look at this type of mapping, there is still a concentration of website ownership towards urban areas, but it's very apparent in the early period of the web. Again, a factor of where the investment was being made, where internet access was, but nonetheless an interesting visualization. I mentioned that we've taken these curated data sets. This is exactly the data sets that we have here. We have data on U.S. media, Occupy Wall Street, U.S. Senate, U.S. House, Hurricane Katrina, and Superstorm Sandy. Not all of these are in nice, user-friendly data sets. Ben Bacalar has been working with me over the past couple of months to help make a lot of this data more available. These projects take time, but we're getting to a point where these data sets will be available to the research community at large to work with and to study. In the meantime, we're cheating and we're using some of the data here on our own and kind of claiming first user right to work with it, and I'm going to show you some previews of what we've done with it. In the data, I mentioned this is metadata. We have information about who was linking to who was connecting to who. We have stuff like Gawker.com linking to a site within Gawker.com about Mitt Romney, and we have the date that that story occurred on. We have what type of content it was, how big the data was. We have any descriptive data that was in there. And we do have, for a lot of the data, all the text that was in there. We don't have it for everything, but for some of this, we have all of the raw text. In particular, for all of the government websites, we have all of the raw text that's in there. We also, with the U.S. Senate and U.S. House data, although it's not listed on here, we have all of the campaign websites for anyone that was in office. I haven't gotten to working with that yet, but a future study for us is to compare what people said when they were running for office versus what they said once they were in office. And because we have the full text, and because we have the history of that, we'll be able to start looking at that as we get better at working with the tools that we've developed. So now I'll shift over and I'll tell you a little bit about the research. And I'm not going to get too deep into theory, but I want to give you some sense of why the theory matters. I'm a communications scholar. I tend to be driven by theory in the research I do, and it's really helpful in working with big data, because especially when you're working with 540 million unique URLs, theory provides you a lens that you can look at the world through. It provides you a way for thinking about what do I do with the data that I have, and how do I drill down to actually be able to understand what I really need to look at. So I'm going to show you a case study that looks at some research that the team I've been working with has done around Occupy Wall Street. It happens to be one of the more complete data sets that we've got, and we had some very interesting research questions in here pertaining to the way that web content around the Occupy Wall Street movement developed in tandem with news coverage of the event and the actual unfolding of the event over time. I tend in the research that I do to take a macro to micro perspective. I use this organizational ecology evolutionary framework to understand how events unfold over time. And what this says is that you want to start at the environment level. You want to start by looking really big picture to understand what was going on in the world at that moment. And then you want to start to narrow down. So if you want to look at Occupy Wall Street, you're going to start by understanding what was the political climate. How were different organizations, different nonprofits competing for very scarce resources like news coverage. News coverage is a resource. So we start there and we say we want to look at news coverage, and we want to look at these nonprofit organizations. And then we drill down and we start to look at populations. Populations would be groups of nonprofit organizations focused on child's rights, groups of nonprofit organizations focused on women's rights, kind of common causes, common groups. And you find that they start to kind of cluster together and they kind of reinforce each other. If you have a lot of organizations focusing on children's rights, for instance, they reinforce each other's mission, they give each other a sense of legitimacy. And that starts to help you to better understand then, once you get to the organization level, why an organization is acting a particular way or driving towards a particular end goal. So that's kind of my worldview, my theory view. Environment, population, organization. And so we'll take that in the context of looking at the Occupy Wall Street movement, which we're going to go back in history a little bit, and we're going to start by looking at February 17th, 2014. And we can actually start to see, just through the web content, the unfolding of this history, unfolding of the movement. The web content gives us a sense of the political climate of the time, the fact that we had people kind of coming together to create a common political cause, kind of the anti-Tea Party movement here. And we can actually trace through. I should have said we were starting in 2011. My apologies. So we can actually start, I have my slides backwards. We can start in 2011 and see the unfolding of the event. And here we can see that rallying cry starting to emerge of the 1% versus the 99%. We can even see individual voices in here. And you can actually see some of the back and forth that unfolded. We can get the political commentary. We can get people interacting and engaging. And so in order to get this multi-level perspective, in order to move from looking at the environment level to the population to the organizations, I look particularly at the way that these groups are connected. So I look at the networks, I look at the interconnectedness, I look at how one website connected to another, how one movement connected to another. And so simply put, I look at the social networks, and there's a really tight connection between these social networks and this idea of social movements, that people need to connect to create action. And so it tends to be my worldview, my methodology for this. So what we looked at with the Occupy Wall Street movement was we looked at the specific groups. We looked at Occupy Wall Street Los Angeles. We looked at Occupy Wall Street Oakland, Occupy Wall Street New York. We looked at Occupy Wall Street DC. And we looked at the interaction that was occurring within these groups and then between these groups. For those of you who remember the Occupy Wall Street movement, what was one of their big rallying cries? Not just were the 99%, but how are they organized? When you think about Occupy Wall Street, what did they say was kind of one of their fundamental organizational beliefs? I'll ask it another way. Who is in charge of Occupy Wall Street? No one, right? Okay, so we have this major political movement at the time rising up, and they're saying, no one's in charge. Anyone believe that? Do we really have this, had we found this ideal leaderless movement? This is my organizational scholar side coming out. I'm like, really? You're trying to tell me that we've got a major movement occurring in the United States and no leader? But that was the rallying cry of Occupy Wall Street. So what we started to look at is the way that interaction was occurring between individuals as seen through the archived web data, as seen through the news coverage, to understand how were people interacting within Occupy Wall Street, Oakland. How were they talking back and forth on their message boards? How were the websites connecting to one another? But then also, how were the different movements connecting to each other? Were they connecting to each other? And from that, could we start to see a hierarchy? So if you can start to see a hierarchy, if you can start to see what we would refer to as clustering in the communication, you can start to see some evidence of order, of structure. So, the businessman in me wanting to say that there's hierarchy and there's order and there's structure in this orderless movement. So what we did in this study is we used multiple sources of data in order to triangulate our findings, to have a little bit more robustness here. We used the Internet Archive data. We focused on 335 Occupy Wall Street related websites. We looked at 333 million edges. An edge in data terms means a connection between two websites. So 333 million connections. We looked at LexisNexis, and we conducted a search to assess U.S. newspaper coverage of Occupy Wall Street. We focused on that 2011 to 2012 period that was key for this movement. We focused on a variety of search terms that pertain to the movement. And then we used Twitter data to try to get more of that micro-level user-to-user interaction. And in this case, we looked at about 750,000 tweets from October 2011 to January 2012. I'm not a fan of Twitter data. It's really hard to get reliable Twitter data because in order to capture it and archive it, you have to know that an event's occurring. So if you think about Occupy Wall Street, you would have had to know this was going to be a big movement in order to accurately capture the data. Instead, what we end up with here is a sample that grew over time once people started to realize that this was a big event. So it's not a great data source, but good enough in this case. Okay, so here we just see newspaper coverage from September 17th through November 1st, 2011. You see some of the peaks for the different movements. And we started to see this some of the data that we were collecting, that there were clear peaks for when the news coverage occurred. There was a clear focal period. And here was our actual newspaper data. This is 105 major U.S. newspapers. October 17th, 2011 to January 1st, 2012, actually runs a little bit beyond that. And this, in particular, focuses on Occupy Wall Street, and this is the Los Angeles coverage. And so you can start to see, again, from that macro level, wanting to understand the environment, the ecosystem. This helps first to give us a framing. I know I have a focal period here. I know I don't care too much before this time period, and I know I don't care too much after the tail end. So it helps us to focus and to think about the data that we want to focus on. And we can zoom in a little bit, and then we can see here are the connections that exist between websites that are of the Occupy Wall Street movement. So this is an Occupy Wall Street Oakland website connecting to an Occupy Wall Street LA website. And we can just see here how many captures there were, how many times we saw instances where there were links between Occupy Wall Street sites. And okay, interesting. We started to see some pickup in terms of the amount of connectivity, but hey, that might not mean anything. It might mean something. We can look at what groups are most tightly connected and how tightly connected they are. But that didn't tell us a lot because we ended up with junk like Twitter being connected a lot to Facebook and a lot of people tweeting Huffington Post stories, and that's what you see right here. Twitter, Huffington Post. They're connected a lot. Okay, so you get a lot of crap in the data. You get a lot of noise. Okay, so we geeked out. We tried to dig a little bit deeper. We looked at the number of edges, the number of connections. We looked at just the number of different websites that existed and still nothing. We looked at how dense the network is. Density is a measure of how many connections exist between Occupy Wall Street movements as a percentage of how many connections there could be. A really dense network is really tightly connected. Still nothing. So then we said, let's look at clustering. Clustering are tightly connected, tight-knit groups of interconnected websites. So this is going to start to tell you there's some structure. And we did see some clear peaks, but nothing that made me jump for joy. And then we started to run some tests. And this is a really basic test, but we did some t-tests looking at the changes in the number of a certain entity that we saw over time. And this just basically runs a bootstrap sample, gives us a lot of different randomly generated scenarios that we can look at, and then takes our numbers and says, well, if we have some randomly generated scenarios, are your numbers significant? And we did actually start to see some interesting points in here. For instance, we saw, if you look, November and December in this data set, we saw some clustering on Twitter, which meant that there were some groups that were starting to form some tight-knit communicative groups. But we started to see some website clusters, and in particular, at the peak of the movement in November and December, we saw the emergence of some really tight-knit clusters of websites, and those clusters stretched across Occupy Wall Street boundaries. So it wasn't just Occupy Wall Street LA, it was Occupy Wall Street LA connecting to New York, connecting to DC, connecting to Oakland, connecting to Portland, connecting to Ann Arbor, Michigan. And we started to see this moment where the movement crystallized and started to form some very tight-knit clusters that were representative of organization, of hierarchy. And we started to see that in the Twitter data. It came a little bit later. It's not captured in this data set. It actually came a little bit later on. And then we saw something else. We saw that in January, February of 2012, it all went away. And it just went poof. And so there was this moment where we started to see an emergence of organization. And then because there really was no one who was taking leadership and setting an agenda for this movement beyond that, because there was no continuation of that rallying cry that carried on really beyond late 2012, but we saw it even earlier in the data that we had, we did see that that organization tended to fade away. And that's a story that we're only able to tell by looking at the data at this large a scale. That we're only able to look at the connections that existed. We can look and see, okay, there was no one in charge, but we can actually see the emergence, that moment where there was an opportunity for organization in the data when we look at it at this level. Longer term from this, we saw some challenges in terms of scaling our methods to larger term web scale. It's by WO notation to web scale. We have some challenges in terms of trying to create some broader guidelines for using this type of theory to guide the research, but these types of case studies that we've started to build out are leading us in the right direction. One of the biggest challenges that comes out of all of this is how to tell this story over time. The statistics are still a little bit wonky for this. This is going to be a challenge for us with the local news repositories that we're building. We can do some really cool stuff like visualizing how websites change over time and how connected they are over time, but we don't really have the tools yet to do robust analysis at this scale. This is a snapshot of New Jersey local news from 2007 to 2012, and what it shows you is how tightly connected different web domains are. And we know just from looking at the visualization that there are periods where the New Jersey local news community.com websites are more tightly connected than others. but we're still working on how, from a networks perspective, to show this statistically. Last thing I wanted to point out is that there are some other really cool tools that others are making available that utilize the same types of data. And so there are researchers who are working on similar topics in other domains, and I'm just going to play this quickly. This is a tool called LegX, and I put the URL up here. This is run by a group of political scientists out of University of Washington, and they've been doing the same type of analysis, working with just the .gov data that we have. They've been looking specifically at the .gov data and the bills that are represented in that data. And what this shows you is in the 113th Congress, the movement of bills through Congress, through from introduction on the left into Senate committees and House committees, and eventually to the president's desk in the middle. They're focused on visualization with the data, so they've been coming out from the archived repositories of .gov data, how bills have passed through, and it gives you a really interesting visualization of how a bill becomes a law. I don't know if anybody remembers the old school cartoon from that. This is a much more modern representation of that. And then just broadly, despite the advances we've made in web preservation, this is still a field that's in many regards in its infancy. Large-scale crawling, like what the Internet Archive does, tends to be very high level but low depth. Custom crawling, like what I've shown you through ArchiveIt, is a much more accurate way to preserve the web at scale and to preserve the depth of web data. We've seen some really major advances in the past 5 years with regards to the open source technology around the space, as well as with regards to the availability of subscription services. In addition, there should be a third bullet on here that I would add on now, which is that the research tools that are available are becoming much more prevalent. Much of what I've shown you is based on scripts, like really raw code lines that we utilize to access the data. I have colleagues at University of Toronto and University of Waterloo up in Toronto who are doing a lot of work developing some more ready-to-use, out-of-the-box software packages, a package called Workbase that allows for readier unpacking of the data. There are also folks at the L3S Research Institute over in Germany who are working on a similar type of project that's going to create more out-of-the-box tools for accessing this data at scale, for using big data techniques, but in a way that's more user-friendly. So there are some ongoing initiatives in addition to the work that we're doing, and it's exciting to see that. We rely on a lot of funding partners for this work. The work here is sponsored by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the National Science Foundation, Democracy Fund, the National Internet Archive, as well as the National Endowment for the Humanities, and couldn't do the work without them. If you have any questions, I've got some time for Q&A, and that's my email and my Twitter account, so feel free to reach out to me.
All right, everybody. Let's give Dr. Weber a hand here.